It was a bright morning in Riverside Hills, the kind of neighborhood where every lawn looked the same and every house had a gate taller than the people who lived behind it. Jerome Williams had walked this route for 12 years, pushing his mail cart past fancy cars and cold stares. He was used to being invisible here, just the black mailman who kept to himself and did his job. But that morning felt different. As he turned up Maple Street, he saw Mrs. Margaret Whitmore standing by her porch. Everyone in town knew her name. She was old, proud, and rich, one of those people whose last name opened doors. But something about her wasn't right. Her white pants had dark red stains spreading across them, and she kept tugging at her sweater like she didn't want anyone to see. Her hands trembled as she reached for the mail, her eyes distant and cloudy. Jerome froze. He had seen cuts, scrapes, even accidents before, but this didn't look like a small injury. There was too much of it. The stains were deep, almost soaked in. He tried to ask if she was okay, but she only mumbled something and turned toward her house, wobbling as she stepped inside. He hesitated, watching her disappear through the half-open door. Then a sharp, metallic smell drifted out, strong and sickening. He leaned closer to the window, his heartbeat quickening. That wasn't wine. It was blood. Jerome pulled out his phone, his hands shaking just a little as he dialed 911. He spoke clearly, trying to keep his voice steady. He explained that an elderly woman seemed hurt and that there was blood on her clothes. The operator asked for the address, and when Jerome said 1847, Maple Street, there was a pause on the other end. The woman's tone changed, softer but doubtful. "Are you sure that's Mrs. Whitmore's house?" she asked, almost like she couldn't believe someone like him had any reason to be there. Jerome's jaw tightened. He'd heard that tone before, polite but heavy with disbelief. He repeated the address and said again that the woman needed help fast. The operator hesitated, suggesting maybe he should call her private doctor instead. Jerome felt his chest tighten. He could almost see Mrs. Whitmore stumbling inside, maybe bleeding, maybe worse. He took a breath and said firmly, "Ma'am, if you don't send an ambulance now, I'll call every news station in town and tell them how 911 refused to help someone because she's rich." There was a long silence. Then the operator muttered that help was on the way. Jerome lowered the phone, staring at the house. The street was quiet, too quiet. Behind the curtains, he could see neighbors peeking out, not to help, but to make sure he wasn't causing trouble. He shook his head. In any other part of town, the sirens would already be there. Here, it would take 17 minutes. When the ambulance finally turned onto Maple Street, Jerome felt more relief than trust. Two paramedics stepped out, one older man with a tired face and another younger guy who looked like he didn't want to be there. They glanced at Jerome first, not the house, their eyes filled with quiet suspicion. "You the one who called?" the older one asked, his tone flat. Jerome nodded and pointed toward the front door. "She's inside." She looked hurt. "I think she fell or something worse." The man sighed like this was already a waste of his time. Inside the house, the air was heavy. The smell hit them the moment they stepped in, something between spoiled food and blood. The once beautiful living room was a mess. Stacks of unopened mail, dirty dishes, and bottles of medicine covered the tables. Jerome's eyes went to the floor, where Mrs. Whitmore lay half-conscious, her lips dry and her skin pale. One of the paramedics rushed to her side while the other mumbled something under his breath about old people who don't take care of themselves. As they checked her pulse, Jerome noticed a folder on the coffee table. Papers were spilling out, doctor letters, appointment reminders, all marked urgent. He recognized his own handwriting on the envelopes. He had delivered these himself, week after week. None of them had been opened. He felt a chill run through him. This wasn't a simple accident. Something was deeply wrong here, and he could already feel it. This woman hadn't just been forgotten. She'd been left behind. The older paramedic looked up from where Mrs. Whitmore lay and gave Jerome a sharp look. "You can go now," he said, waving his hand like Jerome was in the way. "We'll take care of it." But Jerome didn't move. He had seen too much. The woman was weak, barely able to breathe, and the stains on her pants had turned almost black. "Are you going to report this?" Jerome asked quietly. "She hasn't had medical care for weeks. I've been bringing letters from her doctor, none of them were answered." The man frowned, clearly annoyed. "Listen, kid. This lady has more money than you'll ever see. If she wasn't getting help, that's her choice. Don't make this into something it's not." Jerome felt heat rise in his chest, but he kept his voice calm. He'd learned long ago that people stopped listening the second his tone changed. Still, he couldn't stop his hands from tightening into fists inside his pockets. He thought about his mother, how she used to work double shifts at the hospital, how she lost her job after reporting the way poor and black patients were ignored. Back then, Jerome had been a teenager, watching her cry quietly at the kitchen table. The same anger he'd felt that night was back now, stronger. The paramedics lifted Mrs. Whitmore onto the stretcher and started toward the door. Jerome followed them out, his mind racing. They could pretend not to see what was happening, but he couldn't. Something in him knew this was bigger than one woman being neglected. This felt like the start of something ugly, and for the first time, Jerome wasn't going to just walk away. That night, Jerome sat in his small apartment staring at the stack of letters he hadn't been able to stop thinking about. The names, dates, and return addresses were burned into his memory. Every one of them had come from the same clinic, Riverside Hills Medical Group. He picked up his phone and called the only person who might understand what he had just seen, his mother, Dorothy. When she answered, her voice was warm but tired. She'd been working as a private caregiver ever since the hospital fired her years ago for causing trouble. Jerome told her what happened, the blood, the neglected woman, the letters from the same doctor. There was a long silence on the other end. When Dorothy finally spoke, her voice had a slight shake in it. "What was the doctor's name?" she asked. Jerome looked at one of the envelopes. "Dr. Richard Peton." His mother let out a heavy sigh. "Jerome, that's the man I was investigating before they pushed me out. He was behind a program that let rich families cut off treatment for elderly relatives, said it was to let nature take its course. But it wasn't nature. It was profit. They called it estate transition care." Jerome felt his stomach twist. "You're saying they let people die early, for money?" Dorothy's answer came slow and heavy. "I'm saying some lives are worth more dead than alive to men like him." Jerome ran a hand over his face, thinking about Mrs. Whitmore's pale body on the floor. "Then we can't stay quiet," he said quietly. "Not again." His mother's voice softened. "You don't know how deep this goes." But Jerome already knew, he'd seen enough. He promised her he wouldn't let it end the same way it did before. This time, someone would listen. The next morning, Jerome drove straight to the local newspaper office. He had never been inside a newsroom before, and his heart pounded as he asked to speak with an investigative reporter. That's how he met Melissa Santos, mid-30s, serious eyes, not the kind of person who wasted time. When Jerome told her about Mrs. Whitmore and the doctor, she didn't look away or smile politely like others had. She just said, "Show me what you've got." So he did. At a small corner table in a diner across the street, Jerome spread out the photos he'd taken over the years, letters, envelopes, appointment slips. Melissa looked at them carefully, her pen moving fast across her notepad. "These are from different families," she said. "All rich, all patients of the same doctor. And you say most of them died within 6 months after their care stopped?" Jerome nodded. "Always called a natural death. Always after a change in their will." Melissa leaned back, her face tight with disbelief and anger. "This isn't just neglect, Jerome. This is a pattern, and it looks like murder hidden under paperwork." Before they could talk more, Jerome's phone rang. The name on the screen made his chest tighten, Dr. Richard Peton. He answered, and the doctor's voice came smooth but cold. "Mr. Williams, I heard you were involved in Mrs. Whitmore's case. I'd advise you to stay in your lane." Melissa quietly turned on her recorder. Jerome kept his tone calm. She was dying, doctor. Is that what you call care? The man's voice hardened. You don't understand how things work here. People like you should know their place. Then the line went dead. Melissa stared at him. You just got your proof, she said. He threatened you on record. Jerome exhaled slowly, realizing the fight had already begun. Good, he said quietly. Then we give him nowhere to hide. A week later, the story hit every local TV channel and news site in the city. The headline flashed across the screen, Doctor accused of neglecting elderly patients for profit. Jerome sat in his small living room, barely breathing as he watched the report unfold. Melissa had done it. She had turned their late-night talks and quiet evidence into something the whole city could see. The video showed stacks of medical letters, photos of Mrs. Whitmore recovering in the hospital, and clips of Jerome's mother speaking for the first time about what happened years ago. They called me a liar, Dorothy said on camera, her voice calm but steady. But my son found the truth I couldn't. Across town, angry families began showing up at Dr. Peton's office, some holding framed pictures of parents and grandparents who had died under his care. Reporters surrounded the clinic, shouting questions he refused to answer. Jerome could almost feel the doctor's panic through the screen. When Dr. Peton finally tried to defend himself in a press conference, his voice shook. He called the accusations a misunderstanding, but every word only made him look guiltier. Someone in the crowd yelled, "What about the recordings?" And that was the end of it. That night, Jerome drove to the hospital to see Mrs. Whitmore. She looked stronger, her color back, her eyes clear. She reached for his hand. You saved my life, she said softly. No, ma'am, Jerome answered. You saved mine too. You made me see that staying quiet is how they win. When he stepped outside, he heard car horns and distant shouting, not in anger, but in celebration. For the first time, people were talking about what had been ignored for years. And for the first time, Jerome felt seen. 6 months later, the city felt different. The old hospital board was gone, and new rules were written to protect elderly patients from neglect. Jerome sat in a crowded auditorium wearing a clean suit that didn't quite feel like his, listening as the mayor called his name. The crowd clapped as he walked to the stage to receive a medal for public service, something he never thought would happen to a man who once got suspicious looks just for doing his job. In the front row, his mother wiped her eyes, smiling through tears. Beside her sat Mrs. Whitmore, healthy and sharp again, her hands folded neatly on her lap. She gave Jerome a small nod, the kind that said everything without words. When the ceremony ended, reporters asked him how it felt to expose such a powerful man. Jerome thought for a second before answering. When you're invisible long enough, he said, people forget you're watching. But I've been watching my whole life. The next day, news broke that Dr. Peton had been sentenced to life in prison. More doctors, lawyers, and judges tied to his scheme were also facing charges. Justice had finally caught up. That evening, Jerome walked home through the same streets where people used to ignore him. Now they waved. He smiled, still humble, still quiet. When he got home, he called his mother. We did it, Mom, he said softly. Not just for Mrs. Whitmore, but for everyone they forgot. Dorothy's voice trembled with pride. You showed them that even the smallest voice can bring down the biggest wall. Jerome looked out the window at the city lights and whispered, they tried to make me invisible. But now they'll never forget my name.